Is that a new car in the driveway, Miss Michelle? I didn't look up from my lap. The crochet hook moved in a rhythmic silver blur, pulling a loop of soft, cream-colored yarn through a foundation chain. I could hear the rustle of Mrs. Gable's clipboard against her polyester vest. She was the youngest president this homeowners association had ever seen. 32, caffeinated, and possessed by a pathological need to monitor the height of everyone's St. Augustine grass. "My grandson is visiting," I said, my voice low and steady. It's a voice I've cultivated over 60 years. It doesn't give away the weather, let alone my thoughts. "Oh?" "Because I saw 3 young men carrying boxes into your garage at 11 p.m. last night. And there's a black SUV parked on the curb that hasn't moved in 48 hours. She stepped closer, her shadow falling over my work. "We have strict rules about extended guests and unregistered occupants, Michelle. You know the bylaws. If they're staying, I need names. If they're working, I need permits." I finally stopped. I looked at the stitch, a shell pattern, delicate but strong. "They aren't working, Mrs. Gable, and they aren't exactly guests. They're family. Family doesn't need a permit to be home." "The mailbox tells a different story," she whispered, leaning in. "I saw the mail carrier skip your house today because the box was stuffed full of notices addressed to, well, people who aren't you. Is everything all right, dear? You seem a bit overwhelmed." "I am never overwhelmed," I replied, meeting her eyes. "I am merely observant." She gave me a tight, eye-pitying smile, the kind people give to women my age when they think our brains are softening like overripe fruit, and walked away. I watched her go. Then I looked back at the house, my house, the one I paid off a decade ago, the one that currently held the weight of 3 grown men who shared my blood, but not my values. The SUV wasn't a guest's vehicle. It belonged to a man I didn't know, who had been sitting in the driver's seat for 3 hours, watching my front door. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. I know the sound of every neighbor's engine, the schedule of every delivery truck, and the exact moment the streetlights hum to life. I notice when things shift. And for the last 3 weeks, the shift has been tectonic. It started with a phone call from the HOA office asking about the business being run out of my backyard. Then came the certified mail I wasn't allowed to see. And finally, the gifts. On my dining table sat 3 beautifully wrapped boxes. My daughter-in-law had brought them over. She told me they were appreciation gifts for letting her and the boys get back on their feet. Inside were 3 hand-crocheted cardigans and 2 heavy, intricate quilts. They were stunning. The yarn was expensive alpaca blend, the stitching professional. The problem was, none of them knew how to crochet, and I knew exactly whose hands had made those garments. They belonged to a woman named Miss Clara, a dear friend who had passed away 2 months ago. Clara's house had been cleared out by estate liquidators shortly after her funeral. The coincidence wasn't just a mistake, it was a signal. I stood up, my knees popping with the quiet authority of age, and draped the cream-colored yarn over my arm. I didn't go inside through the front door. I walked around to the side, near the garage. The window was cracked just an inch. "She's old, she doesn't notice," a voice said from inside. It was my grandson. His voice was thick with a confidence he hadn't earned. "The HOA is already breathing down her neck. Another 2 weeks of strangers showing up, and the fines will start piling up. She'll have to sell. We already have the buyer lined up for the flip." "And the stuff in the basement?" another voice asked. "Safe. She never goes down there. too many stairs for her hips. I stood in the shadows of my own hibiscus bushes, feeling the cool evening air settle on my skin. They thought my silence was senility. They thought my patience was a lack of peripheral vision. They were using my home as a staging ground for a quiet displacement, turning the very community I helped build against me. They had forgotten one thing. I taught them how to play chess when they were children. I taught them that the most dangerous piece on the board isn't the one moving the fastest. It's the one that controls the most space without saying a word. I looked at the SUV at the curb. The driver caught my eye this time. He didn't look away. He nodded, a silent threat. I didn't flinch. I simply adjusted the yarn on my arm and walked to my front door. The mail had indeed been stuffed. I pulled out a thick envelope from the HOA. It wasn't a warning. It was a formal notice of a lien. Someone had been forging my signature on documents I had never seen, racking up nuisance charges that were now tied to the deed of my house. My family was sitting in my living room when I walked in. They looked like a portrait of domestic devotion. 3 generations of men I had fed, clothed, and prayed for. "Everything okay, Grandma?" the eldest asked, scrolling on his phone. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said, my voice like silk over a blade. "I was just thinking about those quilts you gave me, the ones from Miss Clara's estate. They're so warm. I think I'll need them for what's coming." He didn't even look up. "Glad you like 'em, Gma." I walked to the basement door and turned the deadbolt, not to keep them out, but to keep my own movements quiet. I had work to do. They think they are the ones orchestrating a takeover, but they've made a fatal error in judgment. They've mistaken my hospitality for a weakness, and my home for a prize. They don't realize that a house is only a home until the locks change. And as for the strangers the HOA is so worried about, they aren't just visitors. They are the reason I haven't slept in 3 nights, and the reason I just pulled a floorboard up in the guest room to find something they thought was long forgotten. The game they're playing is loud. The game I'm playing, well, they won't even feel the first move until it's far too late. When family turns into a predator, the only thing left to do is set a better trap. If you've ever seen a wolf in sheep's clothing, or in this case, a grandson in a stolen cardigan, hit that like button and subscribe to Old School Payback. Tell me in the comments, would you have confronted them right then, or would you wait for the perfect moment to strike? Stick around, because the first accident occurs, and the SUV at the curb is just the beginning of the truth. The next morning, the neighborhood was draped in a thick silver fog, the kind that makes the familiar look like a memory. I sat at my breakfast nook, a cup of black coffee cooling in my hands. I didn't turn on the lights. At my age, you learn that shadows are your most honest companions. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. From the hallway, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps. My grandson, let's call him the architect of this little scheme, walked into the kitchen. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than his father's first car, but he wore it like a costume. He smelled of expensive cologne and cheap ambition. "Morning, Gma," he said, reaching for the carafe. "You're up early. Everything okay?" "The birds were loud," I said softly, "and the SUV is still there." He paused, in the coffee stream splashing into his mug. He didn't look at me. "I told you, that's just security for the project. We're dealing with some high-value assets in the basement. It's for your protection, really." "Protection is a heavy word," I replied. "It usually implies a threat. I've lived here 30 years without a fence or a guard. What changed, grandson?" He finally looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the boy I used to bake cookies for. Then, the mask of the New Age businessman snapped back into place. Times change, Grandma. People get desperate. They see a woman living alone in a house this big, and they think opportunity. I'm just making sure no one takes advantage of you. The irony was so thick, I could have stitched it into a quilt. He was the one holding the scissors. Yet he was warning me about the thread. I see, I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. And the HOA? Mrs. Gable seems to think I'm running a warehouse. She mentioned a lien. He waved a hand dismissively. Gable is a bored housewife with a clipboard. Don't worry about the paperwork. My team is handling the administrative side of things. You just focus on your crocheting. Maybe make me one of those sweaters. The ones like the gifts I brought you? I looked at the crochet hook resting on the table. Those gifts were special. The stitch work on that cream cardigan. It's a lost souls pattern. Very difficult. Very rare. It takes a certain kind of person to finish a piece like that. He laughed, a hollow, rehearsed sound. Well, you know me. I only get the best for you. He left a few minutes later, the front door clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the empty house. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway. Then, I waited another 10 minutes to ensure the man in the SUV wasn't watching the side windows. I didn't go to the basement. Not yet. Instead, I went to the guest room, the room they had claimed as their office. The door was locked, a simple interior privacy lock. They thought a piece of thin brass would keep me out of a room I had dusted and vacuumed for 3 decades. I reached into the pocket of my housecoat and pulled out a small, bent bobby pin. It's a trick my brother taught me in 1974. 3 seconds later, the lock clicked. The room smelled of stale energy drinks and hot electronics. They had 3 high-end computers set up, humming like a hive of angry bees. On the desk were stacks of documents, property deeds mostly. I scanned them with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 20 years as a legal secretary before these boys were even a thought. They weren't just trying to flip my house. They were using my name to buy other distressed properties in the neighborhood, funneling the debt back into my estate. It was a classic bust-out scheme, tailored for the digital age. But they had made one massive, arrogant mistake. They assumed I didn't know how to read a ledger. Among the papers, I found a small, handwritten note tucked inside a folder. It was Miss Clara's handwriting. Michelle, they came for the house today. I hid the keys where the jasmine grows. Don't trust the ones who smile with their teeth. My heart didn't race. It grew cold. Clara hadn't died of natural causes. She had been liquidated, just like her assets. And my family, my own flesh, had been the ones to sign the paperwork. I heard the front gate creak. I moved to the window, staying behind the heavy velvet curtains. Mrs. Gable was back, but she wasn't alone. She was with a man in a dark suit who was carrying a measuring tape and a camera, an appraiser. The inevitable was moving faster than I anticipated. They were preparing for a forced sale. I sat down at the computer. I didn't need to crack their passwords. I had watched my grandson type his master code a dozen times while I was napping in the armchair. People forget that old eyes see more because they aren't looking at themselves. I entered the code. The screen flickered to life. I didn't delete anything. I didn't change anything. I simply added a small, invisible line of code. A logic bomb I'd learned about from a tenant I'd once helped with his rent. In 48 hours, every document they had forged, every digital trail they had laid, would be redirected. Not to the police. Not yet. They would be redirected to the one person they feared more than the law, the silent investor in the SUV, who was currently under the impression that I was the one holding up the deal. I exited the room, locked the door behind me, and walked back to the kitchen. I picked up my crochet hook. I had a few more rows to finish on the new piece I was working on. It wasn't a cardigan. It was a shroud. As I worked, I heard the basement door vibrate. A muffled, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't someone trying to get out. It was something heavy being moved. I looked out the window. The SUV driver was on his phone, looking toward the house with a confused expression. He had just received his first update from my grandson's computer. An update that suggested the money was already gone. The tension in the house was no longer a secret. It was a living, breathing thing, coiled in the corners. They thought they were the hunters, but they had forgotten that a trap only works if the prey doesn't know where the edges are. I know exactly where the edges are. I built them. The atmosphere in the house shifted by midday. It was no longer the heavy silence of secrets. It was the frantic, vibrating quiet of men who realized they were losing their grip. My grandson returned early, his expensive shoes clicking erratically on the hardwood. He didn't come to the kitchen to greet me. He went straight to the guest room, the office. I sat in my armchair by the window, my fingers moving steadily. The yarn I was using today was a deep, bruised purple, a morning color. I heard the door to the guest room slam against the wall. Then, the shouting started, not the loud, glass-shattering kind, but the panicked, hushed arguing of people who think they are being overheard by the walls. It's not there. I'm telling you, the ledger file is corrupted. Everything is pointing to the offshore account Michelle's husband left her. But she doesn't have an offshore account. I smiled to myself, a tiny movement that didn't reach my eyes. My late husband had been a bus driver for 35 years. The only thing he left me was a solid foundation and a recipe for peach cobbler. The offshore account was a digital ghost I had whispered into their system, a breadcrumb trail that led directly into a financial vacuum. The SUV guy just texted. Another voice hissed. This was the younger one, the one who usually handled the heavy lifting in the basement. He thinks we're skimming. He said if the transfer doesn't clear by midnight, he's coming inside to audit the inventory. I didn't need to see their faces to know they were pale. The man in the SUV wasn't a business partner. He was a shark, and my family had invited him into my waters, thinking they could control the tide. I stood up and smoothed my apron. It was time for a little theater. I walked toward the hallway, making sure my gait was slightly heavier, my breath a bit shorter. I played the part of the tired, confused matriarch perfectly. "Grandson," I called out, my voice trembling just enough. "Is everything all right?" I heard a loud noise. The office door flew open. He stood there, his tie loosened, sweat beaded on his forehead. "Fine, Grandma. Just technical difficulties. Go back to your chair." "I was thinking," I said, ignoring his dismissive tone. "Since there are so many people around, maybe I should cook a big dinner, like we used to. I'll go down to the deep freezer in the basement and get that roast." The reaction was instantaneous. Both men stepped into the hallway, blocking my path to the basement door. "No," the younger one blurted out. "The stairs, Grandma," my grandson said, his voice straining for a soothing tone. "We told you. They're dangerous. I'll get the roast later. You just stay up here. Why don't you work on that quilt?" I looked at the basement door, then back at them. I let a flicker of suspicion cross my face, just enough to make them think they were successfully hiding something. You've been spending a lot of time down there. Is the dampness coming back? I'd hate for Miss Clara's quilts to get moldy. I put them in the cedar chest down there for safekeeping. The mention of Clara's name acted like a physical blow. They looked at each other. They hadn't put the quilts in the cedar chest. I knew exactly where those quilts were. They were currently being used to wrap the high-value assets they were preparing to move. The quilts are fine, my grandson snapped. Everything is fine. Just go sit down. I sighed, a long, weary sound, and turned back toward the living room. As I turned, I accidentally brushed against the small side table, knocking a framed photograph to the floor. The glass shattered. "Oh, dear me," I whispered, bending down. "Don't touch it. You'll cut yourself." The younger one rushed forward to pick up the pieces. As he knelt, his jacket fell open. Tucked into his waistband was a heavy, dark shape. A firearm, not for protection against strangers, but to ensure the audit tonight went their way. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't hide the sharpness in my eyes. I let him see that I saw it. He froze, the broken glass in his hand. "That's a lot of weight to carry in a house of peace," I said, my voice no longer trembling. It was as cold as the basement floor. "Grandma, it's not what you think. I stopped thinking a long time ago," I interrupted, standing tall. "Now, I only observe. And what I observe is that you've brought a storm into my home. You should know something about storms. They don't pick sides. They just destroy whatever isn't anchored." I walked away before he could respond. I didn't go to my armchair. I went to the kitchen and began to boil water. Through the window, I saw the SUV driver exit his vehicle. He didn't look at the house this time. He looked at his watch. The HOA lien, the corrupted files, the ghost accounts, and the man with the gun. The threads were all beginning to tighten. They thought they were weaving a web to catch me, but they hadn't noticed that I had been holding the loom the entire time. I poured the boiling water into a teapot. The steam rose, obscuring my reflection in the window. By sunset, the first of them would realize that the safe house was actually a cage, and I held the only key. The afternoon sun hit the kitchen floor in long, jagged strips. I sat at the table, not with my yarn this time, but with a silver polishing cloth and a set of heavy, antique spoons. The rhythmic rub-rub-rub was the only sound in the house, a steady heartbeat beneath the frantic whispers coming from the basement. The younger one, the one with the weight in his waistband, had finally gone downstairs. I heard the heavy thud of the freezer lid closing. He wasn't looking for a roast. He was checking the inventory. The front door opened, and my grandson walked in, his face the color of wet ash. He didn't even acknowledge me. He went straight for the landline, a relic he thought I kept out of nostalgia. He didn't realize I kept it, because it was the only line in the house he hadn't figured out how to tap. "The transfer failed again," he hissed into the receiver. "I don't know why. The routing numbers are correct, but the bank is saying the originating estate is flagged for a probate audit. That's impossible. Clara's estate was settled weeks ago." I polished a spoon until I could see my own reflection. Distorted, elongated, and patient. He was right. Clara's estate had been settled. But I had spent my morning at the library, using a computer that wasn't monitored, sending a few anonymous emails to the county clerk regarding the unusual circumstances of a certain estate liquidation. A probate audit meant all assets, including the ones currently wrapped in crochet quilts in my basement, were now legally frozen. Moving them wasn't just a breach of contract anymore. It was a federal offense. "Listen to me," he continued, then his voice cracking. "The guy outside, he's losing patience. If he doesn't see the product or the money by tonight, he's going to settle the debt with the deed. My name is on the secondary filing. I can sign it over." He stopped. He turned and saw me watching him. He hung up the phone slowly. "How much did you hear, Michelle?" he asked. The G-Ma persona had finally evaporated. "I heard that you are afraid," I said, setting the spoon down with a soft clink. "And I heard that you've promised something that doesn't belong to you." He walked toward me, his shadow stretching across the table like a stain. "Everything in this house belongs to the family, and I am the head of this family now. You're 60 years old. You should be resting. You should be grateful I'm taking the burden of this property off your hands." "A burden?" I stood up. "I may be 60, but I am built of the same iron that survived the Jim Crow South and 3 decades of city politics. I didn't back down. This house is a record. Every scratch on these floors, every repair in that basement is a story of how we survived. You aren't taking a burden. You're trying to erase a history because you're too lazy to build your own." He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "History doesn't pay the bills. The SUV outside pays the bills. And since you're so fond of observation, observe this. At 8 p.m. tonight, a truck is coming. Whatever is in that basement is leaving. And by tomorrow morning, you'll be signing a voluntary relocation agreement. And if I don't?" He leaned in close. He smelled like desperation and expensive gin. "Then the HOA lien goes through. The city seizes the house for illegal commercial activity. You'll end up in a state-run facility with nothing but your knitting needles. Is that what you want?" I looked past him to the window. The man in the SUV was getting out. He was wearing gloves. It was 85 degrees outside. You only wear gloves in that heat for 2 reasons: to handle something hot or to avoid leaving prints. "I want what is earned," I said quietly. "Well, you've earned a rest," he sneered, turning his back on me to head toward the basement. I watched him go. He thought he had delivered an ultimatum. He didn't realize he had just given me the exact timeline I needed. I walked to the pantry. Behind the cans of preserved peaches and flour, there was a small plastic box. Inside was a collection of keys, not to this house, but to the one next door, Mrs. Gable's house. We weren't friends, but I had watched her kids when she had a medical emergency last year, and she had given me a spare key, just in case. I stepped out the back door, staying low behind the hedge line. The strangers at my house were so focused on the front and the basement that they weren't looking at the neighbor's yard. I slipped into Mrs. Gable's kitchen. She wasn't home. She was at an HOA emergency board meeting, one I had triggered with a well-placed anonymous tip about a gas leak on my property. I picked up her phone and dialed a number I had memorized 30 years ago. "County Sheriff's Office. How can I help you?" "I'd like to report a suspicious vehicle," I said, my voice changing into that of a panicked, elderly woman, the very stereotype my grandson thought I was. "There are men with guns in my neighbor's yard, and I think I saw them moving something that looked like, well, it looked like the missing inventory from the Clara Thornton estate." I hung up before the dispatcher could ask for my name. I walked back to my house, heart steady. The truck was coming at 8 p.m. The sheriff would be here at 7:45 p.m. And the man in the SUV, he would be caught in the middle. As I stepped back into my kitchen, I saw the younger one coming up from the basement. He was carrying one of the crochet quilts. It was bulging with the shape of something heavy and metallic. "Going somewhere?" I asked. "Mind your business, old woman." I picked up my purple yarn. "I am," I whispered as he walked past. "I am minding every single stitch." The clock on the mantel ticked with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. 6:30 p.m. The golden hour had passed, leaving the house in a bruised twilight. I didn't turn on the lamps. In the dimness, the purple yarn in my hands looked almost black. My grandson and his associate were in the living room now, pacing. They were no longer speaking. The time for persuasion had ended, and the time for survival had begun. They kept checking their watches, then looking out the window at the SUV. The man in the driver's seat had stopped looking at his phone. He was staring straight at my front door, his gloved hands resting on the steering wheel. "The truck is behind schedule," the younger one muttered, his hand twitching near his waistband. "It'll be here," my grandson replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "See, the driver had to take the back routes to avoid the wait stations. We're moving 300 pounds of specialized hardware. You don't just drive that down the interstate." I pulled a loop of yarn tight. Specialized hardware. That was the term they used for the high-end industrial tools they had stripped from Miss Clara's workshop. Tools her late husband had used to craft intricate, collectible clockwork. In the wrong hands, those tools were worth a fortune. In the right hands, they were a legacy. To these boys, they were just weight to be traded for a way out of debt. "Michelle," my grandson said, turning toward me, "go to your room. Now, whatever happens in the next hour doesn't involve you. Everything in this house involves me," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a chilled blade. "I am the foundation. You are just the paint, and the paint is starting to peel." He took a step toward me, his face contorting with a flash of genuine rage. But before he could speak, a sharp, authoritative rap echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't the truck driver. The truck driver would have gone to the garage. This was the front door. The two men froze. The younger one reached for his weapon, but my grandson caught his arm, shaking his head frantically. He smoothed his suit jacket and walked to the door, peering through the side light. "It's Gable," he whispered, sounding relieved. "The HOA lady. I'll handle her." He opened the door just a crack. "Mrs. Gable, it's a bit late for a social call, don't you think?" "I'm not here for a chat, Mr. Martin," she said, her voice high and tight with nerves. I had taught her well. She sounded exactly like a woman who believed her property value was under siege. "The gas company called me. They said there's a reported leak on this block, specifically originating from this property. I have the emergency technician right here." She stepped aside, and a man in a neon vest and a hard hat stepped forward. He held a handheld sensor that was already beeping with a soft, insistent chirp. "Sir, I need to check the basement intake," the technician said. "Now is not a good time," my grandson said, trying to block the doorway. "We're in the middle of a family transition. Gas doesn't wait for transitions, sir," the technician replied firmly. "If there's a buildup in a confined space like a basement, this whole corner of the neighborhood is a tinderbox. I have the authority to call the fire department for a forced entry if you deny access." I watched from my chair. The technician was a man I recognized, a retired firefighter who owed me a favor from back when I worked in the city's legal department. He wasn't there to find gas. He was there to create a record of what was in that basement. "Fine," my grandson hissed, stepping back. 5 minutes, and stay away from the crates. They're fragile." As the technician walked past me, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He headed straight for the basement door. The younger associate followed him, hovering like a vulture. My grandson turned back to the window, but his face went completely white. 2 things happened at once. A large, unmarked box truck pulled onto the curb, blocking the SUV's path. Simultaneously, a sheriff's cruiser turned the corner, its lights off, gliding silently like a predator through the fog. I stood up and set my crochet work on the side table. "The timing is perfect," I remarked, smoothing my skirt. "Don't you think? It's almost as if someone coordinated the arrival of the buyer, the law, and the witness all at once." My grandson spun around, his eyes wide with realization. You called them? You'd destroy the family name just to keep a pile of bricks?" "I'm not destroying the family," I said, walking toward him with slow, measured steps. "I'm pruning it. There's a difference. A tree can't grow if the rot is allowed to reach the heartwood." Outside, the SUV door opened. The man with the gloves stepped out, looking between the truck and the approaching cruiser. He knew the math didn't add up. He reached into his jacket. "Grandson," I said, my voice a whisper of steel. "I suggest you tell your friend downstairs to drop his toy, because in about 30 seconds, the only thing that matters in this house is who is holding a crochet hook and who is holding a felony." The sirens suddenly erupted, tearing through the quiet of the neighborhood. The silent part of the evening was over. The revenge, however, was just beginning to unfold. The blue and red lights strobe flashed against the living room walls, turning my home into a dizzying kaleidoscope of consequence. My grandson stood paralyzed by the window, his shadow jumping against the glass like a trapped bird. "Get away from the light," I said calmly. I walked to the hallway and flipped the switch for the porch light, the signal Mrs. Gable and I had agreed upon. Downstairs, the sound of a scuffle erupted. A heavy thud, the sharp metallic ring of something hitting the concrete floor, and then the technician's voice, no longer polite or muffled. "Drop it! Sheriff's Department! Hands behind your head!" My grandson turned to me, his face twisted in a mask of betrayal. "You set us up. From the very beginning, you knew. I knew the moment you brought those quilts into my house," I replied, my voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "You thought they were just blankets. You didn't realize they were Clara's last testament. She used a specific dye, an indigo she made herself. It leaves a trace on anything it touches for more than 24 hours. Look at your hands, grandson." He looked down. His palms and fingertips were stained a faint, ghostly blue from moving the crates earlier. "That dye is registered in the probate file as a security measure," I continued. "The specialized hardware in the basement is covered in it. And now, so are you." The front door was kicked open. 2 deputies moved in, with the practiced efficiency of a storm surge. They didn't go for me. They went straight for the man in the expensive suit, who was currently trying to wipe his blue-stained hands on his silk trousers. "Stay where you are." "Ah, Michelle," one of the deputies said. A man named Miller, who I'd known since he was in diapers. "We've got the perimeter secure." Outside, the man from the SUV didn't put up a fight. He was a professional. He knew when a play had gone terminal. He stood with his hands raised as they zip-tied him against the hood of his vehicle. The truck driver, seeing the cruisers, had simply kept driving, disappearing into the fog and leaving my family holding the empty bag of their own ambition. The younger one was led up from the basement in handcuffs, his face bloodied from a short, sharp disagreement with the technician, who was actually a plainclothes deputy. He looked at me, not with rage, but with a terrifying, hollow confusion. He still didn't understand how a 60-year-old woman with a crochet hook had dismantled a multi-million-dollar racketeering operation in a single Tuesday. "Why?" he wheezed as they moved him toward the door. Because you mistook my silence for permission, I said, watching him pass. And you mistook this house for a bank. It's not. It's a temple. And I don't tolerate thieves in the sanctuary. Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway then, looking pale but resolute. She held her clipboard like a shield. Michelle, the sheriff needs the statement now. And I've talked to the board. The lien is being stayed pending the investigation. We had no idea they were using your identity for the filings. I know, Alice, I said, using her first name for the first time. Thank you for the gas leak. She nodded and retreated into the night. My grandson was the last to be moved. He stopped at the threshold, his eyes burning. You'll be alone now, Grandma. No one is coming to check on you. No one is going to help you with the stairs or the yard. You've traded your family for a quiet house. I've traded a cancer for a cure. I corrected him. I was alone the moment you started looking at my deed instead of my face. Now, I'm just peaceful. As the door closed behind them, the silence rushed back into the house, filling the spaces where their frantic energy had been. I walked to the kitchen and turned off the kettle that had been whistling unheeded. I sat back down in my chair and picked up the purple yarn. The pattern was almost finished, but as I looked at the empty rooms, I noticed something. A small white envelope tucked under the base of the landline phone. It wasn't from the HOA. It wasn't from the bank. I opened it with a steady hand. Inside was a single key and a map coordinates written in Clara's elegant, looping script. The inventory in the basement hadn't been the prize. It had been the bait, the real legacy, the thing they had been killing each other to find, wasn't even in this house. I looked out the window. The fog was lifting, revealing a clear, cold moon. The night wasn't over. The revenge was only moving into its final, most strategic phase. The silence of the house felt different now. No longer a heavy blanket of dread, but a clean, sharp vacuum. The police tape across the front door fluttered in the night breeze, a yellow ribbon marking the end of a siege. I didn't mind the tape. It kept the curious neighbors at a distance while I prepared for the final stitch. I held Clara's note in my hand. I hid the keys where the jasmine grows. Most people would have run to the garden, tearing through the bushes in the dark. But Clara and I had a shorthand that spanned 40 years of Sunday teas and shared patterns. To Clara, where the jasmine grows wasn't a place in the dirt. It was a specific section of the great quilt we had worked on together for her 50th birthday. A pattern of star jasmine vines that wound around the border of a heavy, double-knit masterpiece. I walked to the cedar chest in the hallway. It had survived the audit because it was too heavy and too inconspicuous for the boys to notice. I knelt, my joints singing that familiar song of age, and pulled back the lid. The scent of lavender and cedar filled the air, a scent of safety. At the very bottom, wrapped in acid-free tissue, was the jasmine quilt. I laid it out across the floor. My fingers traced the intricate embroidery. I wasn't looking for a physical key. I was looking for a message. In the center of each jasmine flower, Clara had used a different color of silk thread. If you looked at them from a distance, they were just flowers. But if you knew the old school way, the way we used to pass messages in church during the long sermons of our youth, the colors formed a map: gold, green, blue, white, a coordinate, a locker, a destination. I stood up and went to my bedroom. I didn't pack a suitcase. I took a small black handbag and my crochet kit. Then I went to the back of my closet and pulled out a small, locked box. Inside was a set of spare keys, to a 1998 sedan that sat in the garage of a woman 2 streets over, a woman who had moved to a nursing home and left me in charge of her assets. The boys had tracked my car, my phone, and my bank accounts. They hadn't tracked the forgotten relics of a generation they considered obsolete. I slipped out the back door, moving through the shadows of the hibiscus. I didn't take my phone. I didn't take my ID. I was a ghost in a floral housecoat, navigating a neighborhood that had tried to swallow me whole. When I reached the sedan, the engine turned over with a low, reliable growl. I drove slowly, avoiding the main roads where the sheriff's cruisers might still be patrolling. My destination was a small, dusty storage facility on the edge of the county line, a place that didn't have digital keypads or cloud-based security. It had a man named Otis who sat in a booth with a shotgun and a ledger. "Evening, Otis," I said, pulling up to the gate. He squinted through the glass, his eyes widening when he recognized me. "Michelle, it's nearly midnight. What brings you out this way?" "Settling an estate, Otis, just like we planned." He didn't ask questions. He knew the look of a woman who was finishing a long, hard job. He pressed the button to lift the gate and pointed toward the back row. "Unit 402. The lock is a bit stiff, but the contents are dry." I parked the car and walked to the corrugated metal door. I didn't use a key. I used the Jasmine method. I reached to the top of the door frame and pulled down a small, magnetic box Clara had placed there months ago. Inside was the final piece of the puzzle, a digital drive and a stack of notarized documents. I sat on a wooden crate inside the unit, the single light bulb humming overhead. I plugged the drive into a small, battery-powered tablet I had kept hidden in my crochet bag. The screen flickered to life, revealing a spreadsheet that made my grandson's bust-out scheme look like a lemonade stand. Clara hadn't just been a victim. She had been a whistleblower. She had documented every bribe, every forged signature, and every silent partner involved in the neighborhood displacement project, including the names of 2 city council members and the very developer who had been mentoring my grandson. They hadn't just been trying to take my house. They were clearing the path for a multi-million-dollar gentrification corridor. In my house, sitting on the corner lot, was the linchpin. My grandson wasn't the mastermind. He was the fall guy. He was the one they had sent in to do the dirty work, knowing that if he got caught, the trail would stop at his stained blue hands. I looked at the documents. They were transfers of title, not to the developer, but to a community land trust I had helped Clara establish in secret. The payback wasn't just about getting the boys out of my house. It was about ensuring that no one like them could ever walk onto this block and see opportunity where we saw home. A shadow fell across the doorway of the unit. I didn't jump. I didn't reach for a weapon. I simply looked up. Standing there was the SUV driver. He was no longer in handcuffs. He was wearing a fresh suit, and he wasn't wearing gloves. He looked at the tablet in my hand, then at me. "You're a hard woman to keep track of, Michelle," he said. His voice was smooth, educated, and entirely devoid of the threat he had projected earlier. "And you're a very convincing actor," I replied. "The sheriff's department must be paying well these days for undercover work." He smiled. A real smile this time. Federal, actually. "We've been chasing this developer for 3 years. We just needed someone on the inside who was smart enough to let the trap snap shut without getting caught in it herself." "I was never in the trap," I said, standing up and handing him the drive. "I was the one who built it. Now, tell me, is the voluntary relocation paperwork for my grandson ready? I'd like him to have a very long, very quiet place to think about his career choices. He's looking at 20 years, Michelle. Minimum. I nodded. Good. That should be enough time for him to learn how to crochet. It requires a lot of patience, something he clearly lacks. I walked past him toward the car. The night was ending, and the first hints of dawn were bleeding into the sky. I had one chapter left to write, and it didn't involve police or developers or even family. It involved a cup of tea and a very specific set of instructions for the local newspaper. The morning sun didn't just rise, it reclaimed the neighborhood. I sat on my front porch in my favorite wicker chair, the purple yarn finally exhausted. In its place was a finished shawl, weighted and intricate, draped across my shoulders like armor. The yellow police tape was gone, replaced by the mundane presence of a mail carrier, sliding a single, crisp envelope into my box. I didn't move to get it. I knew what it was. It was a formal apology from the HOA board, accompanied by the rescinded lien and a notice that Mrs. Gable had resigned to pursue other interests. In truth, she had realized that being my neighbor was a privilege she had nearly forfeited, and she chose to move before I decided to look too closely at her own tax records. A black town car, not an SUV, but a dignified, quiet vehicle, pulled up to the curb. The man from the storage unit stepped out. He wasn't carrying a weapon or a badge today. He was carrying a newspaper. He walked up the path and handed it to me without a word. The headline was bold, black, and final. Gentrification scheme. Collapses. Federal indictments handed down for city officials and local developer. Below the fold was a smaller picture of my grandson and his associate being led into the courthouse. They looked small. They looked like children who had tried to play with fire and only succeeded in burning down their own futures. The land trust is finalized, the man said, leaning against the porch railing. Every house on this block is now protected. The developer's assets have been seized to fund the restoration of Miss Clara's estate. You won, Michelle. Winning implies there was a game, I said, my voice as calm as the morning air. There was no game. There was only a correction. A house is a living thing. It knows who belongs in it and who is just passing through. He looked at the house, then back at me. Your grandson asked for a meeting. He wants to explain things. He thinks if you testify to his character, he might get a reduced sentence. I picked up my crochet hook one last time, checking the tension on the final knot. Tell him that I have already given my statement. Every stitch in those quilts he stole was a word. Every forged signature he made was a sentence. I have nothing left to say to him that hasn't already been written in the evidence locker. The man nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He turned to leave, but stopped at the stairs. One last thing. The offshore account, the one that caused the digital loop. My tech team still can't figure out how an elderly woman with a landline managed to bounce a signal through 3 different continents. I offered him a thin, cryptic smile. When you spend 60 years watching the world change, you learn that the new tools are just faster ways to do old tricks. Knowledge isn't about the machine. It's about the person holding the thread. He laughed softly and walked back to his car. I sat in the silence of my victory. It wasn't a loud or chaotic triumph. There were no cheers, no dramatic confrontations, and no wasted emotion. It was the quiet, inevitable revenge of a woman who had been underestimated for the last time. I looked down at the gifts they had given me, the handmade garments that didn't belong to them. I had unraveled every single one. I had taken the yarn from their lies and rewoven it into something of my own making. The old school way wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about ensuring the future was built on a foundation that couldn't be bought or bullied. I stood up, the purple shawl settled firmly on my shoulders. I walked into my house, and closed the door. The lock turned with a solid, satisfying click. For the first time in months, the air inside was still. The shadows were just shadows. The strangers were gone. I walked to the kitchen and began to boil water for tea. I had a new pattern to start, and this time, I wouldn't be working alone. I had an entire neighborhood to teach how to knit a community that couldn't be broken. The world thinks we grow fragile as we age. They think our silence is a sign of a fading mind. But the truth is, the longer you live, the better you become at seeing the knots before they are tied. And once you know how the thread moves, you can change the whole design. They tried to take my home, but they ended up giving me a legacy. If you've learned anything today, let it be this: never mistake a quiet woman for a weak one. And never try to steal from someone who knows exactly how to unravel you. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this journey, and subscribe to Old School Payback for more stories of calculated justice. Comment below with stitched if you saw the twist coming. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your circle tight.